when you're developing a character, obviously in the first instance you're usually describing a character to somebody who's going to commission the script, so you haven't actually written a word from their point of view. And so what I tend to do is first off write a monologue in the voice of the character I've created that will never be used, that kind of, you know, it can be about anything, about the worldview, about an incident that happened to them, just to start getting the rhythm. And then I'll write dialogue, I'll write a duologue, I'll bring another character in just to disagree with them. You've got to know what they would say in any set of circumstances. I think that's the key. You know, if they lost their car keys, what they say. You're not going to write a drama about a man losing their car keys, but you've got to know what he would say if he lost them. And with gender, I tend to, if something's based on somebody I know, I will always change the gender and nobody will ever spot it. It's a remarkable thing. And with, obviously, you know, if I'm writing a 50-year-old man from the north who's had a bit of luck with writing, then that's one thing, and that, you know, I know what that feels like. But if I'm writing, you know, a 20-year-old girl in London for the first time, I think that's a different thing altogether. And I think that's when you can start just keeping your eyes and ears open, really. My two favourite bits of dialogue that I've ever written are, one's far more showy than the other. And one was Ripley Holden, who was a character who ran an arcade in Blackpool, who was completely outrageous. And he referred to one of his daughter's boyfriends as special needs meets special brew. And I thought, as a description of somebody, I enjoyed that. My favourite exchange is actually at the end of a drama I wrote called Flesh and Blood, between a character played by Chris Eccleston and his father, who has learning disabilities, and his father doesn't know he's ever fathered a child. And I had to write a speech in which the character struggled to express this. And so it's very plain and very honed down, and in the end he goes, and you're my dad. And then I just left, I wrote in this, you know, there had to be a very long silence, it had to be very uncomfortable. And then we go back to Chris, he says, you didn't understand a word of that, did you? And they just, no. And so the plainness of it, because I tend to be quite a showy writer, I think I overwrite, and I'm over-elaborate in dialogue, so I was very proud that I could keep it plain for that moment. In the end, Pennies from Heaven, Dennis Potter's Pennies from Heaven, because when Bob Hoskins opened his mouth and started to mime, I remember thinking, are you allowed to do that? I remember actually thinking that I'd watched enough television drama to know there were rules and this was being broken. And also, broken in such an audacious and entertaining way. So I think that made anything possible on television for me. I think what it does, and I think that writers like Alan Plater and Jack Rosenthal did this brilliantly well, I think what it does is it affects the cultural mood, and if a television drama has a generosity of spirit or shows people there are different ways to live or writes about characters that you might not normally encounter, then I just think that point of view somehow kind of permeates the wider culture. But what I don't think, I'm not interested in agitprop. I'm not interested in, but I am interested in affecting people with story in such a way that they may feel emotionally, politically, psychologically more open to maybe a different way of looking at the world. I'm afraid the best piece of advice anybody's given me as a writer is something of a cliche, but it remains the best thing, which is, if you're writing, come into a scene as late as you can and leave as early as you can. It's absolute standard rule. And every time, even when I'm looking at a piece of work and think it's wrong emotionally, or there's something wrong with the character, invariably there's something wrong with the structure. I think the great thing about BBC Writersroom is that when you're starting out particularly, you know, writing is a very solitary profession, it's a very lonely profession, and you're not going to get honest feedback from friends and family. Oddly enough, friends and family are usually too harsh. It's not that they're generous. I think most friends and family can't quite believe you as a writer when you're starting out. I think it's the hardest thing is to be taken seriously as a writer. And I think that's what Writersroom does. It takes new talents seriously as writers, and I think that's the most important thing. And that's when I was accepted on a writing course, that's what turned it around for me. When people ask about the voice and discovering your voice as a writer, it's always quite a tricky question, because I don't know that any writers are entirely sure what it is they do. that allows them to write that way, and and you're a little superstitious that if you got to the crux of it, you wouldn't be able to do it anymore. But the thing that freed it up for me were two things. There was Malcolm Bradbury said that if you're going to write a novel, for instance, and you had a year to write it, you should spend 11 months finding the voice you're going to write it in, and just a month doing the actual writing, because the thing that attracts people to work isn't actually plot. It's actually, I think in drama it's character, but nevertheless I can see in novel it's the voice of the person telling the story. The voice of the person telling the story has to bring you in. And it's obviously more problematic with screenwriting because you're writing for characters. I only really know what I'm writing about after I've written it, and a critic will tell me. But it seems that I write about men who transgress, men who are having a crisis with masculinity, men who use humour instead of emotion. And I don't know where any of this comes from. So it seems that, but I think the key to any writer finding their voice is to write somebody you disagree with. I just think it can provoke you then into digging a bit deeper and not just writing this kind of weird version of your own biography.